Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello, hello.
Good afternoon.
All right. Good afternoon, Mr. Blair. Are we good to go on your end?
Yes, Madam Mayor.
Well, I call this meeting to order. Thank you all for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Blair.
Madam Mayor, before we start, should the clerk call the roll?
Yes, Ms.
Sorry.
Ms. Thomas.
Councilor Payne.
Here.
Councilor Snook.
Here.
Mayor Walker.
Present.
Vice Mayor McGill.
Here.
Councilor Hill.
Here.
Now, Mr. Blair.
Well, first, I'd like to thank council for gathering here today. Obviously, Friday afternoon meetings, I'm sure there's a lot you'd rather be doing. But what I'd like to say to begin the conversation is when we had our first budget meeting last week, I talked about the term fiscal clarity. And today you're going to hear presentation from a number of our public works and budget staff concerning two major projects, those being school reconfiguration as well as the West Main Streetscape project. And it is my hope that when you hear staff's presentation, they really worked a lot on getting you hard numbers for this presentation that to help you make decisions about going forward. But when we talk about going forward, not only do I hope this conversation can provide fiscal clarity, but also operational clarity in the sense that a number of people on here with both school reconfiguration and West Main Streetscape, a lot of their work plan for the next few years is going to be dictated by these projects and the scope of these projects. And so it's my hope this conversation today, again, can provide fiscal clarity as well as some operational clarity for our public works staff going forward. So with that, I will turn the presentation over to Ms. Hamill, and feel free during the presentations today if you have questions to ask staff, and we will do our best to provide clear and accurate answers. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, John. Good afternoon, Council. Brian, could you bring up could you bring up the PowerPoint, please? So we have lots to share with you this afternoon. And again, as John mentioned, this is as much fact finding for us as it is hopefully for you. And so we want to make this a give and take situation. Please feel free to interrupt with any questions as we go along, and we'll be happy to try to help as best we can. So if we could look at the next slide, what we plan on talking about today, I wanted to just briefly revisit the authorized but not issued list. We're going to talk to you in a little more detail from a project management standpoint on both the West Main Street project and the schools reconfiguration project. And then finally, we wanted to wrap up with a discussion about potentially extending the strategic plan for one more year. Quick couple of housekeeping things. These are the same dates that we showed you last week. There has been one date change, though, wanted to bring to your attention. We originally were planning to go to the Planning Commission at its December meeting, but given the timing of this work session, we wanted to take some extra time to incorporate anything that may come out of this discussion. So we've postponed that until January 12th, and otherwise there are no other changes. So these are the key dates, the goalposts. The end of the game is April 13th. And next slide, in order to get us there, we have a series of scheduled work sessions that will happen throughout the month of January and March.
And Ms. Hamill, if we could just add to that initial list, when we discussed this, we were set to have a discussion about priorities amongst the council to try to provide us some guidance with the budget.
Okay.
We'll do that at the end.
Okay. So we'll jump right in. Last week, we talked about the authorized but not issued list. We supplied you with a list, and we talked about that there were roughly $80 million of projects that had previously been approved by council, and the funding approval for those were with bonds. This week, we were able to go through and clear up some things on that list and actually free up some money there. But before we did, I wanted to just take a second to lend some context to how that list is generated. It's not just the list that we, decide what goes on and what comes off. There really is a method to the madness. And basically it is comprised of a spreadsheet that I keep. It goes back multiple years, but essentially what I do is as marked on these blue columns here, I go through each CIP and literally list the projects that were listed in the CIP to be bonded. When we get ready to sell bonds in a particular year, we go through and look at the status of those projects. And as you know, we typically issue largely on a reimbursement basis, but we don't issue bonds until we know that the project is fairly certain and projected to be underway, and the bonds would be spent within the next 24 months. So the green column here represents each bond issue, the projects that we have contemplated to sell those bonds for. And in some cases, the funding changes, or our CIP budget comes across with more projects than we actually build in, because sometimes we backfill with cash. And so that's sort of what that yellow column is just the reconciliation. And then finally, the purple column is what's left. So this is kind of a year over year summation of projects that, again, have been approved through the CIP budget, and then we just have not sold the bonds yet. And that's how that list is generated. So if we skip to the next slide, we were able to go through this list and look at what was on the list to figure out what could be cleaned up, what could we take off, and just administratively some housekeeping items. The old Lynchburg project was on the original list for $1 million. Since then, that has been removed because those funds, the project was closed out and those funds were moved to the CIP contingency. Similar with the Martha Jefferson Neighborhood Streetscape and the CHS Fieldhouse, those two projects were closed out as well. And so we no longer need to hang on to those in terms of selling bonds. And then the project housing redevelopment, that was on me. I just failed to take that off the last list. That was a last minute add in our last bond issue, and I just hadn't updated the list when I gave it to you. So of those things, we were able to remove about $6.4 million off of the list that we don't need to hold our capacity for, basically. And so sort of revisiting the quick math that we talked about last week to get you down to your credit limit. I rounded to the nearest million just to keep the math simple. But on the box on the left, we talked about that you basically had a remaining bond capacity of about $52 million. Or in other words, that was basically the bond spending credit limit we had to get you to your maximum debt ratio of 10%. Again, these are rough numbers, they're estimates, there's a lot of variables that go in here. So this is not meant to be a number that you stick on to the exact penny, but rather just a guideline to guide your discussions. And as we work through the CIP in terms of how to set priorities and where you want to, place your spending. After these revisions, if we look to the box on the right, again, the 10% debt ratios at 192 million. Again, at rounding to make the math easy, if we say that the bonds authorized but not issued is at 74 million, that gets us to 118 that we could issue to get to our 10%. And then with the plan that was put forward as part of the FY21 budget, excluding FY21, which was actually appropriated, there were $60 million worth of bonds that were planned to be authorized for the CIP projects that were laid out in 22 through 25. So that gets us down to a remaining debt capacity of about $58 million. And so part of, to circle back of where we started our conversation last week is with the 58 million, again, that would get you to your maximum bond capacity. We also, along with that, have affordability issues about whether we actually want to spend all that credit limit, how would we pay for it? That was some of the stuff we talked about last year. But also, of all of these numbers, the two biggest projects that have material impact on either what you do going forward are both the West Main Street project, which have large dollars that have been allocated to it and are a large part of this authorized but not issued. It's a little over 18 million at this point. And then also, what does that mean and what do you want to commit in terms of the school project? So we thought what we would do today is to spend some time and let the project managers talk to you about some things that they have found, some key points and direction that they need from the project. And so with that, I'm going to kick it, unless somebody has some questions. I'll stop here for a second.
Have we got any information back about the bid, or this is pre-sending that information out?
So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. Are you speaking of the school project?
Yes.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about that. There's some key points that sort of need to be answered that help with that process, and we will get to that when we get to the school project.
Chrissy, a couple of questions. First of all, when you say that a project has been closed out, I assume that means it's been finished.
Finished, or these remaining funds are not needed. Yes.
Okay. As we talked about last week, there are some things on there that are, shall we say, rather cryptic. Lump sum from 2017, for example. Mm-hmm. I guess I'm sort of puzzled generally by the notion that there would be a project that we had authorized in 2017, or that the school people had authorized in 2017 and that we sent them the money for, that hasn't been finished yet, or hasn't even been started yet, or hasn't been gotten to the point where it might be bonded yet? Why would that happen?
Great question. Yeah, part of what we sent, and again, it was just before this meeting, and we'll also put it out on the webpage. So I think what you're speaking to is the lump sum accounts that were on the authorized but not issued, and they were listed as FY18, FY19.
Well, that's part of it, but the general question would be, I mean, some of these other projects go back apparently many years to the date of authorization. And I kind of can't help but feel that if we've gone 4 years without actually doing something we thought was important 3 or 4 years ago, that maybe it wasn't that important. Or maybe there's some particular reason that I don't see off the top of my head as to why the project hasn't yet been done, but is still important.
I think that's a fair point. So if we're excluding the lump sums from that, I think you raise a great point. The projects that are on that authorized but issued but not issued list, they are just that. The different projects are at various phases. Maybe some have not begun at all. And if there are particular ones that we want to discuss, we can, pop the list up and talk about that. There are some that are at various stages of planning. And so we don't sell the bonds until we know the project is either underway or will be well underway, and the bonds spent within the 24 months. And so that's why there are projects on that list that we have not sold the bonds yet, because it has not materialized. We certainly don't want to be paying debt on something that hasn't happened.
Sure, I guess where I'm sort of having trouble is with the suggestion, and let me preface this by saying, I really think it's one of Charlottesville's major weaknesses that we keep going back and rehashing decisions that have been agonized over 3 years ago. And I am not anxious to do that. But on the other hand, if a project that people thought was important 3 years ago, nobody has felt important enough to move it forward to action, I wonder whether that is something that we ought to be thinking about rethinking.
I think it's a fair question. And I think as we talk about priorities, and as we talk about, approaching on big projects such as the school reconfiguration or even West Main, and if it comes down to a point of making decisions, it's certainly a fair question and a fair exercise to do that.
Are there any things in particular that, has staff attempted to go through and say, okay, this is something that maybe right now we don't really need all that badly? I'm just looking at assuming that things are put in roughly chronological order on your list, looking at the top items. There's things for undergrounding utilities and sidewalks, and we'll talk about the West Main streetscape, city schools HVAC replacement plan. Should we be asking for a current status of, or a current assessment of how important the need is on all of these $74 million worth of projects?
So, speaking specifically, one thing to keep in mind is we are always about a year behind in terms of this list. So there are lots of dollars on this list that were just approved in FY21. I'll pick on the school HVAC account, since that's one that you raised. Roughly $18 million of that, $1.8 million of that is for budget that was approved in 20 and 21, and we just haven't sold the bonds yet. And so and there are some things that are just our savings accounts. So that's kind of the conversation that we talked about last year with sidewalks, where we decided that we were not going to put money in there because there was an available balance to spend down. And so the sidewalks account that's here is that maybe money They are somewhat in chronological order, but because the sidewalk account is something that we contribute to almost every year in the CIP, it is a cumulative effect. And so that may be just dollars from the FY21 or 20 budget that we just haven't spent or sold yet, or we're saving up for, a big sidewalk replacement, or we were doing lots of studies and figuring out how to best apply those dollars. And again, I can defer if we want to talk specifics. We have some experts on the phone that can maybe speak to some of these projects. The other thing I would say to you is that before we sell bonds, we do what's called as a spend rate projection. And every year we send out a summary to all of the departments and say, hey, here's what you have in the CIP. Give us an update of what you plan to spend between now and whatever date we're looking at. And what is your spend plan for, the next year? And we have that data. I think the last time we did it was as of January. And so a lot of what you see here are sort of accounts that get new funding every year. But again, there are some other things on here that are sort of one-time things that haven't happened yet. And again, to your point, it's a fair question. Do we want to revisit that, or does council want to revisit that?
Well, I don't want to bog us down anymore. You've got a lot to talk about. There's some other things I may call you about on the side. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
I'll just raise, this was raised, I think, in our last meeting. There are also just issues of our own staff's capacity to execute on some of these projects.
Sure.
So are there any more questions on these details or the authorized but not issued list before we move on? Okay, so hearing none, I'm going to pass this on to David Brown, Public Works Director, and we're going to talk about the West Main Street project.
Thank you, Chrissy. So as it was commented, there are some projects that are out there right now that as we're going through this process, two in particular, the West Main Street project and some school projects that are what I would define as our big ticket items. And because of their size and their complexity and the cost associated with it, one of the things we want to do is to follow up with City Council to discuss these couple of projects to get further understanding and guidance from City Council. As Council may recall, a couple weeks ago, there was a presentation with regards to the West Main Street project, where we're at, and in regards to the funding mechanisms. One of the directions given by City Council for us was to go back and also look at if there was any potential as far as cost reductions through value engineering. Staff has done that as well. But when we look at the projects overall, and tying into what Chrissy had just identified, is that these projects have some significant commitments to them. And when you look at the CIP overall list needs for projects, there just isn't enough funding to go along with it. So what we want to do is to have these discussions with City Council to get the direction, but also to get staff's recommendation on what we think might be a prudent means to go for projects and moving forward. So from this standpoint, I've got engineering to talk about the West Main Street project, and also facilities development to talk about the school projects as well. So from this, what I'd like to first do is to move into the West Main Street project, and for the city engineer, Jack Dawson, to give an overview of the project, the funding and where we're at. As presented, this is a multi-phase, multi-year project. And so let's go into a brief discussion with that. So Jack, if you may, please.
Sure. Thanks, David. Again, as was discussed, we were in front of you not too long ago talking about West Main Streetscape project and seeking whether or not this was something we want to proceed with a value engineering study, which we've done. And that's essentially that report has not been finalized, but yesterday we did have a call with the consultant that did that analysis. And so based on that analysis, with the direction that the value engineering study was to maintain the vision of the original project, the result of that was that the value engineering consultant found what they thought was about $3 million in savings across the projects. And just to summarize that, we did give them the direction that we want to maintain the vision, which largely was the sense of space, the trees, and as much on-site stormwater management as was possible. And the result was essentially through changing site furnishings to less expensive products, eliminating all on-site water quality treatment, and then making some guesses about how water quantity might be made more efficient. The $3 million is what they came up with so far. That seems to me to be a little bit of aggressive estimation. But that being said, the result is that the total project cost is $49,300,000. Of that, about 20.5 million comes out of what's already been allocated locally to that. We've already spent 3.1 million, almost 3.2 million of that money on the design thus far. We've got a further 3.2 million, or rather from the state so far, we've got 7.2 total already allocated, of which we've spent $47,000 and sought reimbursement of, which would mean were we to cancel the project, we would owe $47,000 to the state. What's yet to be identified are these yellow boxes, which is 2.3 million and 8.7 million for future phases that have not yet been allocated, which would likely have to come from local funds. And then the state dollars applied for on the bottom row for phase 3 represents our smart scale application for phase 3, which would pay for phase 3 in its entirety, which is pending in front of the state right now, the grant application. So these are sort of the numbers we wanted to present, and I'm happy to take any questions regarding these or the status of the project.
I was just curious where the university's commitment falls into play here.
Yeah, so we did not include that on the chart. We talked about that at our last work session. That's a total of $5 million. It's not clear to me that that money is going to materialize or could be used. As I understand it, phase 4 being closest to the university was the intent. That's not in the letter that I've seen, but that was the intent. So if that was to be applied, it would be applied against that 8.7 million of phase 4 unidentified funds, leaving us with essentially 3.7 required of local funds for phase 4. If all 5 million were to be go towards this project.
So tying into what Jack has referenced, the project itself overall does represent a significant amount of investment on the city's part. And so asking council to take that into consideration as we're talking about the CIP items. Again, Chrissy had identified there's a number of projects out there right now that are requested but are still unfunded. By looking at this type of a project and the amount of funds that are involved with it, if the city so chooses not to move forward with it and in another direction, it would give the opportunity for the city to look at those other projects and potentially fund those to move those forward.
What does phase 2 entail?
Phase 2 is the scope of that is from just beyond the Drury Bridge to, I'd have to look at the exact map, but they're in linear chunks moving west from the intersection with 5th, from the Lewis and Clark statue.
I'm sorry. So is that on the downtown mall side of the Drury Bridge, on the other side of the Drury, the university side?
I believe it's from Drury Bridge west is phase 2.
Okay, is that towards the university or towards the downtown mall? I can't do the west east.
I'm
thing.
sorry. From Drury Bridge going towards university
Okay.
is phase 2. And again, at some point that transfers to phase 3, and phase 4 is the smallest scope as you approach the university down there, or the corner.
So,
And what is that $4 million state allocation for?
So for phase 2, that is money we've already received through various grant processes for phase 2.
Okay, what I guess I'm wondering is, can we cut some of our funding in phase 2 and still utilize that state allocation?
Well, so that's sort of what we were discussing last time a little bit, is that, and what I wish I had an answer for you was, if we wanted to do the bare minimum on this project, what would that cost? And can we move the needle from what that is to where we're at now with the design? And that is not, as these numbers, we've spent $3 million on this project already, and there's not, no asphalt been poured, no concrete's been torn up. There's a lot of time and effort that goes into putting these things together. And we already, for phase 1 and phase 2, the projects that already have state allocation, we would have trouble. We would not be able to tinker with the project at this point and use any of the state money, because they've already approved the scope, our scope, that says, here's our goal. This is what we're achieving. The state only pays for certain things. They don't pay for the betterments or sort of the aesthetics or underground utilities and those sorts of things. And I mean, we could have a more detailed conversation if you'd like, but that $4 million covers more specifically the pieces of the estimate for the project that deal with multimodal safety improvements, the bike lanes, the signals, things like that. And so, again, I would love to say, well, we could cut $3 million here and $4 million there, and this would be the result. But that's quite the lift to articulate.
But does value engineering, those ideas can be implemented without impacting state dollars? Yes.
Correct.
Or no? Okay.
Correct.
To Ms. McGill, to address your inquiry, the way the projects were presented, there is a cost share. You have the cost share on the state side and the cost share on the city side. So as going back to what Jack was saying, if you start revising the scope, you're dividing the project into different components. And by doing such, you are now then, with changing the scope of work, you're changing the dollars that's associated with it. And if we start making that reduction, yeah, we could do it, but then you also reduce the state's allocation as well. So it's not, we can use all their dollars. Well, if we give up some, they give up some as well, in short.
And from a coordination standpoint, it's not a sliding scale where we can tinker with it. It requires renegotiation with the state about what it is they're paying for, what we want to achieve.
Would that be inclusive of if adjustments are made to phase 3 or phase 4, that would impact state allocations for either phase 1 or phase 2 in terms of needing that renegotiation?
No. I think the short answer is no. Keeping in mind that it's a corridor, and it's sort of been considered as a corridor, a 4-phase corridor so far. So what I mean by that is, while we've only been working on phase 1 and phase 2, the consultants have generated a lot of information about what phase 3 and phase 4 will look like, because the sidewalks and bike lanes and all those things are similar. And so that's why we could do the result of the value engineering study for all 4 phases, because they are so similar. So we've made an application to the state for phase 3. We presently have no commitments with the state in that regard until they give us funding, at which, we can always deny the funding once they give it to us, as long as we don't spend it. But so technically phase 1 and phase 2 are not wrapped up with the ultimate outcome of phase 3 and phase 4, but more realistically, they are. And I know that was confusing. I hope that answered your question.
No, I think so. And I guess wrapped up as well, and maybe this was your meeting, sort of raised the question of the utility of making investments in only part of a corridor and then just stopping it. There was like an estimate of deferred maintenance costs or improvements that probably need to be made no matter what at some point throughout this corridor, correct?
That is correct. There is utility infrastructure that needs to be performed, from my understanding of the project. That would be done in advance of the road work portion being conducted. Part of this project also includes undergrounding various existing overhead utility that are used by or owned by outside entities, but that's part of the streetscape beautification portion of it. It's not being done, but it's not required by the utilities. It's more for a betterment of the overall project. So part of this project, when you look at the total 49.3 million, it includes that utility work as well. But if I recall, and Mr. Silliman, he and I had a brief discussion on this, and correct if I misstate this, Mr. Silliman, is that the utility portion that's owned by the city is not included in this 49 million.
That's my understanding. Correct. And just for context, if you were to look at routine maintenance of this corridor in its entirety, including complete milling and repaving, sidewalk hazard repairs, upgrading handicap ramps, ADA ramps, replacing the signalized intersection infrastructure in its entirety, you're looking at probably a little bit over $3 million to replace everything and repair everything that's out there right now as it is today. And so that's just a rough estimate. I think probably conservative, but a little bit more than $3 million to just kind of revamp what's there today.
Sorry, was that 3 million?
3 million, correct. A little bit over 3 million. I think it was around 3.2. I mean, if you assume 5 million, that would be conservative, and it would give you a little bit of fluff for escalation, or even including some betterments like curb bump outs or green bike lane marking, things like that.
So to put the question that people keep asking me, why can't we just get rid of this $18 million expenditure and do something else with it? What do we lose if we do that? Aside from we have $3 million already sunk costs. We've got other maintenance costs that we would have to incur anyway. There's going to be some digging up of the street to deal with the utilities anyway. What else are what are the other considerations here?
Mr. Snook, I'm not quite sure I'm understanding your inquiry.
Well, okay, I'll put it to you the way it gets put to me on Facebook, which is admittedly not a very scientific way, but here's the question. Why are we spending $18 million? Let's cut the $18 million from the capital budget for the West Main Street project and spend it on schools instead. And my question is, aside from, I have a gut feeling about what the answer is, but if you've got some specifics, it would be helpful to be able to say, number one, we already know we're going to have to spend $3 million on maintenance over the next umpteen years. We already know we're going to have to spend whatever the other responses are. How much of any of the West Main Street project stuff is truly cuttable?
Well, if we look at the project overall, and you heard staff make a couple of comments with regards to, if we were to go out there and replace it, yeah, it's going to be over $3 million just to replace the existing infrastructure. Then I do not have the cost for the underground utilities that the city owns, what that cost estimate is. So, but that is work that would have to be done as well. So, and that's not reflected in this 49.3 million. So if we look at overall, the project itself was intended, from my understanding, to just create an extension of one portion of the town that already exists to make it look similar. And the question I think is being presented right now, does the city council want to proceed with doing that, or would it prefer, as you mentioned, moving the additional funds to other infrastructure that could be expended and do what's basically just necessary? And that's sort of what Mr. Silman was referring to.
I think it would be helpful if we had, or at least for me, if we knew what the basic costs would be and how do we get that information. If it's not, just how close it is to the local allocation for this overall project. And I think that'll eliminate some of the questions that we have, because then we would know if it's 3 million plus another 4 million, and that takes care of everything that's basic that needs to be done in all 4 phases. That's, we know that that's a significant difference from the, the $20 million local contribution that we would be, weighing in on. And then I guess we could still have the conversation with the university about, well, if we are scaling the project down, what would you all still commit this dollars to? And then we would know whether they are saying, if you scale down, we're not committing anything at all. If not, or we're committing X number, of dollars. And I wonder if having the conversation before, we make a decision after the counselors are finished answering the questions, because the priorities discussion that we're going to have, I think if you're saying we can do either or maybe neither, like whatever that conversation is going to be, we may need all the information to even arrive at the point of view if we are being told at this point that we won't be able to do both of these projects, and what that looks like. We still will need to know what staff will be presenting and adding to the CIP budget for the amount that will be needed, and whether we go for it or not.
Okay, so if I can briefly summarize that from what I've heard, is that what we can do is we take this scope of project, identify the budget amounts, so that we can do an actual comparison to what's presented here with the West Main Street project as it's represented in comparison to what the actual needs would be. So if we didn't do what's proposed here on the West Main, what would be the actual infrastructure improvement cost estimates for a project? And then provide that to City Council, as well as include our discussion with UVA and their portion, if they would still be willing to provide that, correct?
And what you all believe would be possible in terms of modifying the state, the documents for the state review, and whether they would approve any additional, whether they would still approve that the project in conjunction with the new dollars, that items that you all give us, or would that money be only tied up in the current West Main Street project?
Okay, so adding that, if VDOT would approve or concur with a revised proposed scope, and how much of that would they support in funding?
I think that would be helpful, or it would be helpful for me.
All right, we can certainly do that.
But when we're talking about that scope, we have to recognize, this is on a sliding scale of like how much we're going to do in this corridor. Is it going to be this whole thing we propose, or is it just the bare minimum? And I think that somewhere in, it's hard for me to look at it as just those two binary options, because there's a lot of other things gained by the whole reason that this took place was just to make this corridor more usable for pedestrians, for cyclists. And if we're just replacing what we have, I just struggle with it, just doing it just to that effect. Like I said, like there's one extreme of going all the way to what's been explored and what's been funded up until now. So I'm just struggling a little bit with it being like this versus that, because I just think that there is some value in us really taking these steps to improve this corridor. So I'm just struggling with that myself.
Well, and to tie on to what Mr. Solomon had mentioned earlier, one of the things that we discussed was that 3.1 or 3.2 million just for the existing infrastructure that Mr. Solomon mentioned. But then he also identified an estimate of 5 million. So that's taken above the 3.2 to 5. And with that is looking at the potential of adding those other components that you were just referencing, Ms. Hill, of where we do the various sidewalk improvements. We would do some bump outs for enhanced pedestrian crossings at signalized intersections. We can look at the pavement widths and if we can accommodate improved bicycle facilities as well through that corridor. So the objective is trying to achieve the various amenities that are part of the scope of this original project, the West Main Street project, but just primarily focusing on what do we truly need first and meeting those needs, then moving forward with what we can and what that estimated cost was. So I think that what you're asking for is looking at the basic, but also still trying to achieve what was represented here as far as the picture or scope of the initial project itself, because you don't want to lose those components. Did I understand it correctly?
Yes, thank you. And I thought that I heard from Jack that when we do this kind of a scope change, that it would be kind of going back to the drawing board with funding from the state, is what I heard.
If we change the Appendix A, which is the initial cost estimate that we submit to the state when we get these fundings, we will have to renegotiate that with them. It is, and Jeanette can clarify this, I believe this is mostly smart scale, which is we're not matching the funding, which is revenue sharing, if you're familiar with that. There is some federal dollars tied up in this, but generally, if you look at phase 2, for example, where we have 7.1 local against 4 million state, our portion is covering the betterments. It's matching possibly the states if we have revenue sharing, and then we're covering the betterments. So it's certainly feasible, and that it wouldn't be a short process where we just shoot VDOT email and say, oh yeah, this is fine, but it would be feasible to scale that back. But you know, while these are the correct questions, you know, you could point at any corridor in the city and ask me and Marty how much it would cost to get it up to snuff. And, you know, all these things are expensive. I think that it's really hard for us to quantify, again, that sliding scale. Well, what about here? What if we get 30% aesthetics and all of the infrastructure? That's an extremely difficult thing to do, anybody. You know, even these value engineering studies this is not a bulletproof $3 million. This is sort of people spending 2 weeks on what's been a 6-year process to do the best they can to find savings here. So I think if there's sort of a qualitative, definitive, we want what's on this, then it sells itself. Anything short of that is pretty hard to define. You know, it's not like if this project were to go away immediately, we'd give a CIP request for $5 million saying, absolutely, next month we need to start replacing these handicap ramps as well. They're, you know, as I understand it, this project started from a planning exercise, and while it's solving a lot of engineering infrastructure problems, that wasn't the intent. And so while that's a nice benefit from engineering, you know, infrastructure maintenance standpoint, I think we will do the best we can to get you all the information, but I think it's really more of a qualitative assessment of this at this point. Yeah.
So,
Thanks for the reminder that it has been 6 years this has been worked on.
so I have
Any numbers that you all give us against whether we have the dollars, even once you all do that. So, yeah.
And it's going to take us working with the budgeting department to ensure that what we come up with, you know, we've got the funding there, or if there are going to be some challenges, and that would be part of the follow-up, ma'am.
Could I ask a somewhat more limited question? And that is, I'm not asking that you guys go back and renegotiate anything, but just recognize if this project started 6 years ago, none of us on council were here then. None of us bought into it then. Some of us have only been on council for 10 months now and have had very little exposure to it. And so to a certain extent, it's just speaking for myself, although I'm prepared to assume that you all knew what you were doing and the prior councils knew what they were doing, I kind of need to be sold. And part of what I need to be able to do in talking with people about this project is to explain to people why it is that we're spending $18 million, why it is that basically $60 million a mile is what this comes down to, is an appropriate expenditure of local funds, much less state or anybody else's funds. And I know that we're trying to do an awful lot of things in that mile, but or 0.8 miles, I guess it really is, if you look at the entire project. But I need to have some way to tell people why this makes sense, other than just, well, I assume that council knew what they were doing 5 years ago. So I'm just asking for sort of a re-explanation, perhaps, of stuff that you all probably think we know, but we don't.
Well, understanding the question, I would say though, Counselor Snook, I mean, there are some qualitative and policy level aspects to that question. I mean, you know, aesthetics, for instance, or I'm going to assume Mr. Brown and Mr. Dawson aren't prepared to really give you a recommendation on that, or why that is how it is in the plans right now.
Well, but if there is maybe even a simple matter of, there's already a document that council got 5 years ago that needs a couple of numbers updated, and you could shoot it to us and we could say, okay, now I understand. I mean, I've been justifying it to people when people have asked me about it by saying, you know, there are all kinds of things that we're trying to do here. And some of them, for example, I know that the water and sewer lines that run up and down Main Street are going to have to get replaced, and that's going to happen, but that's not, the cost of that isn't a part of our cost here. It's being borne by the Rivanna Water and Sewer Authority. But still, once you're digging up the street, it seems to make sense to do other things that have to be done while you're digging up the street. I completely agree with Councilor Hill and the suggestion that there are value aspects to this, that this is perhaps the most important mile of city street that we've got in terms of our connection to the university, in terms of the way that hundreds of thousands of people a year see Charlottesville, and the way that people get to and from the two centers of our economic activity, being downtown and the corner. So I completely agree with all of that. I'd really like to have more information that sort of justifies the expenses, so that I have a better argument to make to people when they say, just cut out $18 million and let's go spend it on schools. So I'm not looking for a renegotiation. I'm looking for information.
Mhm.
And
that's
it's,
understandable.
sorry, I was just gonna say, my first 2 years on council, there were certainly other colleagues who consistently spoke very thoroughly to that point, and I'm happy to go figure out like where some of that commentary was, because there was a lot of thought put into just kind of even getting us up to speed on these decisions Myra made, because every year this topic has come up. I'm just not as prepared as they were, because like, again, they were part of that decision making, but I'm happy to go uncover where some of that background information was, for sure.
I have a few questions, please. So the way I'm calculating this is, right now we have identified $20.5 million of local allocations. If we've already spent 3 million of that, we're looking to the design, the value engineering looks like it can cut about 3 million. We would have to spend 3 to 5 million in the corridor anyway. So that drops us down to 8 to 11 million that is actually getting allocated beyond. Is that correct?
Your last bit of math lost me there. But
Yeah.
Okay, so we've spent 3 million.
correct.
We're looking, the value engineering says we can probably cut about 3 million.
Correct.
Oh, but that's all 4 phases. That includes phase 4.
Yeah,
Yes.
correct.
All right. So that's going to throw, I don't know how much of that is in phase 4. If none of that was in phase 4, And we would need to spend about 3 to 5 million in that corridor in delayed maintenance, deferred maintenance, repairs after replacing. That really brings us down to between $8 and $11 million. That's above what we're going to have to or already have spent. Except for another $10 million that is unidentified yet. Or almost actually 11 million that's unidentified. So that.
And that assumes that in phase 3, the state awarded all of what was applied for, which is certainly not guaranteed by any means.
Okay.
And when earlier, when you were saying like the maintenance that was needed no matter what, my understanding was that would be outside of this $49 million anyway. Is that correct?
No, that 3.2 million number that I mentioned, that's basically assuming that at some point over the next number of years, we're going to have to repave all of West Main. We're going to have to come through and do hazard repairs on the sidewalk, fix crack sidewalk, heave sidewalk, things like that. There's, I think, 6 signalized intersections out there. At some point, each one of those signalized intersections should be replaced in its entirety. Only one is at the point where it needs to be done right now. I think there's another one that's due for in the next, several years. The other 4 are probably, 10 years, 15 years down the road. And so that 3.2 million, not all of it would have to be done, like next week or next year even. We would probably push out paving and the hazard repairs for sidewalks until all the utility work is done. And so even that 3.2, we're looking at another, 2 years out before we even start any of that. And so between now and then, it's just routine repair if there's an immediate hazard for like a tripping hazard or something like that.
So to address your question, Mr. Payne, if you think about from the perspective, the project right now, the 49.3 million encompasses the work that Mr. Silman was just referencing. Okay. And to your point, Ms. McGill, the situation to remember is if you look at the costs that are presented for phase 3 and phase 4, those are unfunded. Those are still dollars that the city would have to get funding for the next phases. We've only received funding for the first 2 phases. This project represents 49.3 million over a longer period of time. And the situation is that what's going to occur is when you think about that $4.3 million, you are thereby having the obligation to the city of over, I think it was 25 million or more. And I have to, again, we'll go back to my numbers, those are dollar amounts or funds that the city is obligated to. So when you think about debt service, you're not going to be able to account for that because you've got this obligation. And this is not only on this project, but it's also going to be tied into what we're going to get into with regard to the schools as well. And that's part of the reason why we want to discuss these 2 projects, because these are 2 big projects that the city is going to be making a commitment to. And from a staff standpoint, we want to ensure that we're getting the appropriate direction, we're giving you the necessary information that City Council can have to make the decisions that it may need on these projects.
I have just one final question. I guess the way I've thought about the policy decision for us is that sort of the policy goal achieved here is you have a main sort of artery road for bike and pedestrian connection, in that completing those bike ped connections here would be a significant sort of game changer in the accessibility of the entire city for bike ped, as well as that sense of placemaking where you have this stretch of road become a place that's geared much towards being like a specific place in levels of urban design that just transform the character of it and just make it a very different kind of a signature place, left sort of to a lesser extent the way the downtown mall is kind of like it has an aesthetic and sense of place to it. And that's the policy trade-off, is whether we're just doing strictly what's needed engineering wise, but if we do that, I don't see, we're obviously, I don't, there's no way for us not to sacrifice those policy goals of like the critical bike ped path for the city, as well as that sense of placemaking. So that's just how I'm thinking about it. And I guess the final question I have is, it seems like the major challenge now is with like the budget crunch, the coronavirus and the pandemic has given us, obviously, is delaying the timeline or changing the scope of it in terms of the timeline to better meet like the immediate budget crunch we have. Is that not feasible to do without sort of sacrificing these bigger policy goals that have been worked on for 6 years? Or is that just kind of delaying an inevitable choice we have to make?
Well, and I'll ask Ms. Hamill to also comment on this, but from my perspective, there's two components. The first in regards to the state allocations that we have. You know, that has a timeline to which we've committed to for constructing these projects. And with that thereby ties up those funding, city funds, to which are identified for allocation to these projects. And you bring up a very good point, Mr. Payne, is that with the COVID, I believe it has affected our revenue in coming into the city. And again, I'll defer to Ms. Hamill to comment on that, or Mr. Davidson, or even Mr. Blair pertaining to this. But it is affecting, I think, revenue. But that's from what I've seen in other municipalities and even state organizations. Everyone is seeing that right now, and it is having an effect. So from our perspective, I think in looking at these and developing an appropriate plan and how we want to address CIP dollars, it's prudent for the city to take that into consideration. And Ms. Hamill and Mr. Davison, let me ask you to chime in or present what your thoughts are as well.
John, did you want to chime in first, or?
Well, I did want to first be absolutely right. Obviously, COVID-19 has affected incoming revenues in both the lodging and meals, and we will have to wait for the collection rate for real estate to see how it affects that in December. But a point Mr. Brown made, I think Councilor Payne, I want to make sure your question's answered. You know, it sounds like what you're really asking is there some deadline that we have to begin work in order to preserve state funding? Is that a fair question? Is that a fair summation of where you're going? That do we have to make a decision now as a city and starts actual moving?
Or I guess just getting a sense of like, one, yes, whether it affect, you know, if delaying the timeline foregoes the city money, but even if we forego the city money and we say like, you know, in this next 5 years, you know, we're going to focus on what's just necessary engineering wise, does that foreclose entirely the original vision developed under this plan, which was obviously much more expansive? On thinking like longer term.
Well, I think right now we're kind of deferring some of these other things, knowing that we might be really taking this more in-depth look and tearing everything up. So I think if we were to depend at some point, there's a point where we just can't push it out any further. Very similar conversation we're going to have with the schools too, that you just can't keep kicking that can down the road because these roads they're not being repairable at some point. And so I guess maybe that's also, I would add a little nuance of my interest in understanding that too.
And then, but no, I mean, I think I have a sense of it anyway. And then the real final last thing is the 10 million, there's around 10 million for undergrounding utilities that the state's not, or Dominion's not paying for. That's in that 49 million, right?
Yes. This is the total project cost.
Okay.
Outside of whatever Rivanna, those things that aren't in our scope that are coordinated with it. And just sort of to answer maybe Mr. Payne, a little bit your question, even going back to Mr. Snook's comment, the benefit, as Marty said, we have 6 signals here, 1 needs to be replaced. If this project goes forward as is envisioned, you're going to have a brand new, everything in that corridor is going to be brand new. Of course, phase 1 will be like 5 years old by the time the whole thing's done. But beyond that, that's the idea. So all of the infrastructure, all the maintenance will ultimately be taken care of there. Quantifying when that second pole needs to get paid for if we didn't do this, or what that immediate maintenance looks like is very hard. And I think to Mr. Payne, your comment, the issue with West Main is that there's a defined right of way there, obviously, with buildings on either side. So the primary purpose of this, beyond replacing the infrastructure, is to improve pedestrian safety and bicycle safety. That's by doing the bulb outs, doing the indicators and all of those things, which are a benefit. Doing the bare minimum engineering is not going to achieve that, which would probably, that's what VDOT gives us money because we're meeting what their VTrans safety scores and all of these things. So that is probably, that's probably unlikely that we could, going somewhere in the medium between the bare minimum and what we have now is going to be very challenging to do and negotiate through VDOT, I guess is my point there. Quantifying how that when we pull the trigger on various things, what the expenses are for maintenance is also very challenging. But the idea, you get a final product, everything's replaced under this instance, and we have served the goal of improving the corridor for especially pedestrians and bicycles. And so if that's the goal, this is what essentially it's going to cost. And something short of that is going to be something different that we can't quantify right now.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Everyone, if I could jump in real quick. Hey, this is Jason McAwee from Utilities. And I just wanted to clarify that the utility work in the corridor for the city will be done regardless of this project, whether or not it goes forward. We have to do that from a compliance standpoint and from a safety standpoint. And as everybody has talked about, the monies to perform that work is not in this budget, and that will come out of our own CIP. But there is no, at this point, there is no Rivanna work planned in that corridor either. It's all our work, all utilities. And I just wanted to make that clarification.
And just to kind of loop back to that and jump in on that as well, just to be clear, when Jason talks about that's not part of this budget, that is correct. What we're talking about here is the general government bonds. And so that is what's funded with our CIP. Utilities have their own bonds that they issue, and they are not part of this discussion that we're talking about here. So the work that they would be doing would be paid for and would not have any impact on the numbers that we're speaking to here. And then also, if I can, because I know we get kind of, down into the weeds and the detail, but just to kind of zoom back out from a big picture perspective, what the discussion is here is that as we look at the CIP and as we contemplate the school project, which we're going to talk about soon, the question does not necessarily have to be either or. Either we do West Main or either we do a school. I mean, from the prior slides that we showed you, if you wanted to commit, let's say, $50 million to a school project, there's certainly capacity with what we know right now that you could maintain this Water Street project at the $18 million mark. So if I understand the message correctly, like you could maintain phase 1 and 2, and you could do a $50 million project. But what that means is, one, there's affordability issues with that. And so what commitments are you making, or what trade-offs, as Councilor Payne frequently talks about, what trade-offs are you making in order to be able to afford that, number one. And number two, what trade-offs are you giving about the unknown? Because at this point, if you do them both, you've spent all your credit limit. and you've spent it for quite a long time. And so that means that, you know, other than what's on the CIP right now for years 22 through 25, as was shown in the CIP last year, unless you shuffle something there, there are no more big projects that we can add because you've basically spent your entire credit limit. So it comes down, you know, unfortunately, these two projects have we've had these discussions, and it does feel like it's an either or contemplation. That's not intentional, but as we look at spending, you know, are you willing to commit $30 million to do this from start to finish, all 4 phases? If the answer to that is no, then, you know, are you willing to commit with the 18 million that you've already committed to get you to phases 1 and 2, and are you done there? So I don't know if that helps or hurts, but I know as we talk about these details, you know, for me, I have to kind of keep track of the big picture. And I guess I would say also to that is that, you know, of some of these options that Mr. Silman has brought up and Jack has brought up, like if we decided to do just the maintenance, number one, anything off of the 18 million is a savings. So if you spent $3 million to pave or to do the sidewalks or whatever else it is, you know, that's roughly $15 million you have to allocate to something else. So I don't want it to be an either or, but just kind of keep track of the big picture, and not to pressure you all for necessarily a decision of whether it's phase 1 all the way to phase 4, but kind of what we're talking about is, and I think this gets to Mayor Walker's point, is, you know, when you set priorities, how much flexibility do you want to give yourselves for the future? And how much are you willing to do the hard work that even if you decide to do these, you have to pay for it, and that's a trade-off somewhere else operationally.
And I know you're saying that we don't have to make a decision, but I feel like we keep having this conversation. I would like for us to make a decision, because if you all are not tired of having it, I am. And I haven't even been here for 6 years. So I just put that out there, but I understand if there is a, you know, desire to spend more of our time having the same conversation over and over again. I also think that it might be helpful if we have the conversation and what your presentation regarding the schools, so that we, if there's a decision point or points to ponder again, that we can just decide those.
Excellent segue.
All right, indeed, an excellent segue. So I want to discuss a little bit about the reconfiguration project, and this bit of the presentation is a lot less numbers oriented than the last bit, because we're kind of coming to you asking for a little bit of guidance along those lines. But I think it would be important for us to go through a little bit about what we're talking about, what the reconfiguration project is and what it's intended to be, and also what our objectives are, and to give you a kind of an update on where we are with that process. So essentially, what we're talking about are Buford and Walker, and these are sort of the main objectives that were laid out in December of 2018. In a CCS board meeting, they've also, some of these same points have come up in different times as well. So the plan is to utilize existing public properties, so no land acquisition would be required, just due to cost. We would like to expand the preschool and provide best-in-class wraparound services. Move 5th grade back to the elementary schools. Reduce middle year transitions. So by adding the 6th grade to Buford, or assumedly Buford campus, we would make that a 3-year school. 5th grade goes back to elementary, so there's one less transition. Secure our open campuses. So both of the Buford and Walker campuses presently require students to go across open ground to get from one building to another. We'd like to secure that up. Upgrade the facilities, which are over half a century old. So if you spend any time at either of those facilities, I think you would agree that they're in need of some work. And then this is the big one, and I think the driver for the project really is to undo a configuration decision that was made back in sort of segregation era planning. So it basically isn't serving the students best, so that's why we are interested in reconfiguring. Go to the next slide. Are we moving on? Sorry.
It is on the next slide, Michael.
Okay, sorry. It looks so similar. So these are the planning phase elements. And so basically, at some point we had a conversation where we talked about which path of several paths that we wanted to take in terms of planning this. There's sort of a, one path was to simply move the project all the way forward. One was to do a grand planning exercise where we looked at all of the schools in the system and make some decisions there. We chose the middle path, which involved a planning process that was limited in scope. So that process is meant to determine the impacts on the spaces, both classroom and common, from the fifth graders getting pushed back to the elementary schools. So, you know, when you move those fifth graders in, what you're essentially talking about is moving the pre-K out of the elementary school, moving the fifth grade in. In terms of numbers, that's a relatively similar swap. But in terms of how a fifth grader uses a space related to how a pre-K student uses space and what we need the schools to do to accommodate that is something that we decided needs some study. The space needs for associated with, you know, if there are any additions at the elementary schools that we have to undertake in order to accommodate those students. And then the main thing outside of that is to examine cohort size changes based on, this is a little bit complicated, but if you think about parents are presently choosing typically to take their students out of the city schools if they are going to do so as they make the transition into Walker. And then there's another move out of our schools as they transition into Buford. If you take one of those transitions out and you renovate the school that they would be going into and make it a better school, a nicer environment, there's some idea that more students may stay in the system. So that's something we want to plan for and account for in our construction plans. We can go on from there. And then, so to bring you forward to where we are, we've had $3 million allocated by council for us to begin our planning and design work. We issued an RFP for design proposals, and we're in negotiation to hire an architect to do that work. Now, we have been in negotiation since February on this, but because of the COVID stoppage on our expenditures, we basically put that on pause and have recently picked it back up. What we expect to see from our architect as part of this initial phase is a visioning document, which gives us a general idea of what we're planning to do. A goals and objectives document basically lays out exactly what it is we intend to accomplish. And by the way, each of these would be, you know, considered in the group as opposed to behind closed doors. A capacity study update. So basically finding out how many students are currently in our schools and what the projections are for the future. Early childhood and central admin programming documents. So basically laying out the program for the school, meaning how the space is going to be used, who goes where, and what's needed in terms of increased space. And then a middle school programming document. It's the same idea just for Buford. Then we would move into conceptual design and schematic design for each of those buildings. And basically, by the time we get to schematic design, we expect to have design to the point of having floor plans, visualizations, meaning you would have some renderings so you could see what the buildings would ultimately look like. And that's for 3 layouts at each school. So essentially, we're given a set of options. So along with this process, and those 3 layouts would reach schematic design probably in December of 2021. But along the way, in June 2021, we should get our first set of cost estimates. So that'll give us an idea of what exactly it is we're planning on spending for each of the different layouts that they present. It could be kind of a low, middle, high arrangement or something like that. And then another revision of those based on what our choices are would come in December. So, you know, this gives you a kind of a roadmap of where we're headed and what we're trying to accomplish. I think that essentially all of these deliverables that I'm showing you can be achieved for somewhere around $1.5 million. So that's about half of our allocated $3 million. And the reason it's laid out that way is because $3 million kind of ends us in a strange place in our design phase. So it's also, you know, it's pretty difficult for an architect to set up a plan without knowing exactly or even generally how much the project will cost. Which brings me to the sort of big question. I think, you know, the number 58 million was kicked around early in the process. Completely by coincidence, it looks like 58 million is about what our capacity is. I believe, you know, a lot still needs to be determined, but I think that $50 million is approximately the lowest amount of commitment that we could give to this project. And so I think that we're kind of here to sort of talk about how we get to that number if we intend to do the project.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And so I think, you know, that's a good point. And as we talk about the CIP and where we are right now, you know, some of the idea is that this project is only in the CIP for this study. So we have only to this point allocated $3 million. So how do we get to, you know, there from here? And some of the things in terms of guidance from council as we talk about this, you know, and as John has referred to, you know, financial clarity, you know, is there the desire at this point of this council to make a minimum commitment of $50 million? And as Michael's told you, that's basically the minimum. You know, that's one question. And if you are, then, you know, help us understand where you are in terms of how to get that accomplished, because there are ways that we can structure this and things that we can do. So for example, you know, when would you anticipate wanting to start in construction? Is that something we want to start right now? Is it something that you're willing to wait and say, okay, yes, we want to do this, but we want to wait for 5 years. And we want to take some cash that we would normally allocate to something else and save up, if you will, to buy down some of the anticipated debt for the project. That's one alternative. And we could look at some scenarios there. Additionally, if you were going to contemplate this project, do you want to look at the impact of any existing school funding that currently exists in the CIP? For example, we have in the plan $1.25 million annually for what we call school priority improvement projects. Would it be your vision that instead of giving that in addition to this project, that those dollars would now for the foreseeable future be redirected to funding for this project? And then secondly, do you have any expectations from the school, for the school to commit to making a way or a path forward to find the funding for this project? It would, or how would the 40% formula be impacted? Is that a conversation that needs to happen? And also, are you willing to ask the schools on their side that, we're going to commit to this project, but equally, are there operating reductions that you can make to help make this affordable? And so those are kind of some of the big picture questions that if we could get some guidance on, it certainly helps to sort of plan, provide you with more information as a path forward. And with that, I don't know if we want to stop here and you all ask questions or discussion.
Yeah.
We're thinking of,
Is there somebody?
oh, go ahead.
So yeah, I think just being on the CIP committee also, I think that it would be important. One, I think that maybe when we have our discussion with the school board, that this exact presentation, I know I saw 2 school board members in attendance, but it probably would be helpful for us to cover, this as part of that meeting. And then I think all of the above, if this is the goal, and I've been seeing this in budget meetings for the past few years, that we all are going to have to understand that we're not going to be able to do everything. I just think that without knowing how the schools feel about that, we won't necessarily be able to make a decision that in today maybe about that. I will say that I have been having that conversation and will continue to have that conversation about, in terms of operation, the annual amount. I've had questions about, as I asked during our last budget meeting, about whether there were some things that we have money allocated for that we won't need as a result of this project. And figuring that out, I think, is very, helpful for us all. But I think as a community, we all have to understand that we're not going to be able to do everything the same as we're currently doing if we initiate a major project like this. So I do understand where you are coming from, but my other point is that $1 million that they've spent, that's spent annually, it sounds like that we may have to spend more, right, Michael, based on what this at those schools. That
Well, I want to be totally clear about what that $1 million is. That is a modernization fund.
station, yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, that has been a program where we tried to modernize our classrooms and teaching space for kind of the future of education. That doesn't go to those sort of, well, it does a little bit sometimes, but generally speaking, it's not meant to take care of sort of general upkeep and maintenance sort of work at the school. That being said, we could pivot on that. We could use those funds that way. But if there are needs associated with the transition from into the elementary school of the 5th grade, I think that $1 million is not, it'll need to be augmented in order to get that accomplished.
Yeah. And I think what I was asking or trying to say, based on what I've seen, if we go in and we do these major projects at the school, like whatever we decide, we're going to bring it up to, it's going to be current, the new construction will be current. And so what those dollars are used for, if it's that, school's year to get those dollars, then some of that would already be done.
Right.
I'm thinking not that we wouldn't continue to need to do that in places.
Right. The one thing about that is that all of those, so far, the elementary schools have taken priority. We've gone through 2.5 of them at this point. So we were not anticipating getting to Buford or Walker for another 3 years. So it wouldn't have really changed that, but yeah, that's a point taken. Certainly, we would not need to modernize anything that we had just done a major construction project on.
And to the point about Buford and Walker and going back to this anticipated construction date, I mean, for some time, they have just been kind of kicking can down the road in terms of putting any investment in those facilities. And I don't think we have a ton of time before we do something meaningful in both of those buildings, just from the pure facility standpoint. And I will just say that also, when we think about this minimum commitment of 50 million, I think that regardless of reconfiguration or not, we're going to need to be committing a real sizable amount of money for these schools. My concern, and I've said this in some of these other CIP meetings, is that I don't think 50 million is realistic for what the scope that we're talking about. And so then what would that mean if it is 80 or more? That's kind of where my head is continuing to churn on that. And we don't know until we have obviously the next phase of data.
Yeah, unfortunately, those numbers aren't too far off. I think once we get to that sort of first step, we'll have at least an order of magnitude on, what really is it going to take to get this done. But
60 has been the number, right, that we have heard the most. Is it?
Sorry?
Has 60 million, around that number, has been the number we've heard the most?
Yes, I think that's about what I've heard kicked around the most. Yeah, and it seems like a generally fairly logical number, but it really depends a lot on market factors. Things change in the construction industry pretty quickly. So.
And just to kind of circle back, I think that's how the West Main Street project gets into this conversation, because if we really are saying that we're at probably closer to 80 or 60, we don't have that capacity. And so, not at your debt limit or your affordability, because even getting to your debt limit, affordability is an issue. And so if there really is a strong commitment for the school project, and we really do think that 50 is not the number, but yet it's something higher, then we do need to, as Councilor Snook brought up, start going through this authorized but not issued list. We need to really take a serious look at West Main Street and set priorities for where you want the spending to be, because if the school project is the goal, then we've got to figure out how we're getting there.
Yes, to the question of fiscal clarity on this, as others had mentioned, 50, 60 million has been thrown around, but it's conceivable it could be perhaps conservatively, I don't know whether it's conservative or not, but 100 million. It wouldn't be impossible that it could get up to there by any means. That's not in, even 50 million is not in any of our CIP projections right now. And if it's in that upper limit, 80, $100 million, even if we cut West Main Street, we wouldn't have the debt capacity to do it. And then I think the bigger question for us is, even if it's in that debt capacity limit, I think obviously the affordability question is really vital to the realism of any decisions we're making. And if we're going with this, it seems pretty clear we'll have to identify significant cuts within the CIP budget, and then perhaps other areas as well when we're looking at the realistic probability to handle that affordability question. Because I think Councilor McGill last work session made a very just rough on the fly calculation that if we were to go to our bond capacity and just assume we only covered it with tax increases, it could come out to about a 20-cent increase in the real estate tax. And that's just not realistic. We're going to need to identify cuts and make significant reprioritizations in order to make it happen, even if we don't go forward with West Main Street.
If I might just jump in for a moment, Mr. Payne, I think your point is very well taken, that this project could grow to a number that is beyond what's even being kind of contemplated now. But the decision around a number or a range to work with, in some preliminary discussions, the term, we need some guardrails, right? As the negotiations with the architecture firm move forward, and as that planning phase moves forward, knowing that there are some things that we won't be able to do. And that realistically, the exercise or the assignment is to design within some parameters. I think that's where there's a little chicken and egg, of course, because if there's no guardrails, then the planning phase can go crazy, right? Then we can try and accomplish, an extended or an expanded scope. There are guardrails. There are things that we can't do with this particular project.
I think based on some of our previous discussions, just until we know what those, like the company is just going to present, like based on what I've heard, what we need to do this thing that we said. I don't think it's a situation like just what we were talking about with West Main, where we're adding all of these items for aesthetics that we may need to take out. Like we are not asking, for that with the schools, right? So then within the documents we get, we'll be able to have conversations and a presentation around, we can do X or Y, but we'll be able to do that once we get the documents, right? Just whatever they give us, we'll still have to sit down with staff and the school board and have a conversation about, of these things that are presented, this is what we can do at this moment, and this is what we would either not be able to do or delay. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I also think just having this conversation and seeing all these numbers laid out is useful to us, because it gives us the idea that, the sky is not the limit. We're going to be working right along with the architect on this. I mean, this isn't something where we give them homework and send them off and, they come back having done their homework and we accept it for what it is. This is more of a process where, we'll be in contact with them on a very regular basis, kind of checking in and getting reports on where things are headed. So, and giving them those initial guardrails. I think at this point, we already know that the higher end of what we could have thought of is off the table. Now it's just a matter of kind of trying to figure out how we can build a funding strategy that gets us in the front door and hopefully gives us a little bit of leeway to build schools that are appropriate for, a town of this quality, frankly.
Chrissy, could we talk a little bit more through the formula and how that would play out? Because I know at some points we've talked about if we were doing a tax increase, not this giant one that was being discussed, but even if we did a small tax increase and if it was justified with it's going towards schools, that we could extract all of that, 100% of it, versus saying it's 60% and then they're using 40% for operating. So can we just talk through a little bit about what that would look like and what kind of decision making would be needed to take that kind of an approach?
Sure. So, I think last week what we used was an estimate of about $8.50 as a penny of based on the tax rate. If you're not allocating the 40% to school operations, then you get the whole $8.50. And so that's pretty easy math. If you are going to comply with the formula, then you're only getting about 60% of the $8.50. And so it sort of climbs from there. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but is that where you were going?
I'm just trying to get a sense for, I'm sorry, hypothetical. Let's assume we did like 5-cent raise of taxes and it's $8.50 times 5. And just trying to understand how that might help alleviate some of these pressures that we're seeing if we didn't do something like that. I'm just trying to explore, because that's something that we have told the schools we would need to kind of go out into the community with them and to sell that as like another revenue source for us to try to achieve these, even if the numbers are 60 versus 50. These are things we're going to have to figure out.
Yeah, and so I think if the discussion today leads us to, yes, we want to commit. We're looking at a minimum of 50, and please go look at some of these scenarios for us. Then it's an easy thing for us to do, to run some scenarios to show you what that might look like in terms of tax rate, in terms of the money you would be able to contribute to the school contribution. And so I personally am not good at doing math on the fly. Excel has completely ruined me. So, you know, I think if
Oh,
you
we
could,
don't need math. I was just more just strategically, like, how would we kind of work through that decision making? And
yeah, I mean, and you know, some of the other scenarios that just off the cuff we've talked through is that, you know, if you wanted to take the $1.25 million for the next 5 years and set that aside, you know, that's $5+ million that you buy down of debt you don't have to borrow. That means less of a tax rate later. But that doesn't solve the immediate needs that may or may not be present from a maintenance standpoint or some of these other issues that, you know, the whole reason why we're doing this. And so certainly we could look at it. There's lots of ways to structure there are different ways to structure the debt. You know, there's lots of scenarios we can look at. But we kind of have
but
to
it sounds
know.
like right now you want direction from us on these two major things.
Yes.
And then do you also want us to go through and identify anything that we've found on the bonds authorized but not issued list that maybe we have a different timeline we consider under them? Anything we say is going to create some enemies for us, I guess. But
Well,
Yeah. Oh, sorry, John.
I'm sorry. Before we go there, one other thing that I just want the council to be aware of that we've talked about is, you know, you have now obviously with COVID, there are issues probably with fiscal year 21, but typically you have an operating surplus every year. You know, you can look at a policy change. If you go forward on these projects that the council says we're going to dedicate, you know, all or a certain percentage goes directly to funding these capital projects and buying down the projects. I just wanted to throw that in there. That's another policy lever that the council can employ. You don't know, obviously, as you don't know what your surpluses will be if there are any, but if there are some, that also is a policy lever you can pull.
well, thank you for a reminder, but historically that at one point, some other council, there was some percentage or some chunk of it that was allocated for every surplus. This bit is going to go towards CIP, and then the rest is up to council's discretion, and we would make decisions. Is that the case historically, that we have had some portion of it that we've tried to commit to the CIP?
So we have a financial policy that says anything over and above the 17% minimum fund balance in the general fund automatically goes to the CIP contingency. As a matter of practice, as part of the year-end process, we have come to council and said, you know, here's your surplus number. This is what's over your 17%. By the way, here are some things we'd like to use it on. And then also council at its discretion has spent some of that. And so there is a net number that has gone to the contingency. But as a matter of policy, without further action from council, anything over the 17% goes to the CIP.
But to Ms. Hamill's point, I mean, I think that's a matter of policy, but the practice has not necessarily followed that policy, and we could try to again craft policy so that practice ends, if that's what the council wants to do, again, to buy down debt capacity.
And in theory, that's what that transfer was for, is to provide more PAYGO. It's one of the things we talk about in the bond rating. We get kudos for that. Is that one, we have a policy that we pay a minimum of 3% cash in our CIP, but within our year-end transfers, we've really historically been more at about a 5% PAYGO. And so, you know, if the school project were important, and to John's point, if you wanted to dedicate this to schools, then we would want council to take the action to say, first of all, we're going to follow our policy. We're not going to do any other special requests for this money, and we're going to dedicate it not to the CIP contingency, but to this school project that's going to happen at a future date.
All right, so I guess now we have to figure out where what direction we want to give to staff. Go ahead, Lloyd, sorry.
Well, I had a couple of other questions that relate to the presentation, not so much to the discussion that we've been having over the last 5 or 10 minutes. I was curious, there was a reference early in the presentation about the need for this restructuring or realignment or reconfiguration based in part on segregation era decisions that we're trying to remedy. What were those segregation era decisions?
Well, I wasn't here obviously, but
I don't think any of us were.
The way it's been explained to me is that essentially when segregation was ended, there were two schools, Walker and Buford, and at that point in time, it was sort of a geographical breakdown that determined which of those schools you went to. And if we didn't have the current 5, 6, and 7, 8 split, those were considered, I guess, 3-year middle schools, which is kind of what we're going back to now. Either 3 or 4-year, I'm not sure. But
3 years.
My understanding is that the perception was that those geographic breakdowns were essentially racial breakdowns. So it was it ended up, whether intentional or not, I have no idea, but it ended up basically continuing a segregation type feeling in town.
Okay, but the configuration we're dealing with now is a 1990s era configuration.
Right, and so that at that point, I guess it was decided to reconfigure and to get away from that segregationist mentality. Again, I don't know the truth or whatever of that. But when they did that, they introduced all these new issues, such as the multiple transitions. And my understanding is that the feeling is that the schools still have a segregated feeling based on sort of a loss of student body into private schools and that sort of thing that happens at a couple different occasions as people make transitions.
Which was actually my next question. Any idea how many students transfer out rather than go to Walker or to Buford or to CHS? Are we talking 10 or 20 a year? Are we talking 50 a year? How's that happening?
Far more. I wish I had the numbers in front of me because I don't have them off the top of my head.
Okay.
But they are significant, like in the hundreds, numbers of students that are lost, both at
each level
transition and then again at the Buford transition.
Okay. And I take it then that the 50 million or 60 or whatever we're talking about is only to renovate Walker and Buford. It is not for renovations of the elementary schools.
That is correct. And our best understanding presently is that the elementary schools can approximately take this switch off of students without any serious impact to their capacity. However, that might not be completely true. And the underlying issue is that, yes, we still will have all of those elementary schools that were built when they were built. The newest would be the 1960s. And, you know, they're in some need of, at the very least, a high quality maintenance regime.
But what we're being asked for here is not the cost of serial renovation of elementary schools year after year after year. It's just the Walker and Buford.
No, this is simply Walker and Buford. And I think, you know, there is some consideration that the design phase, that the planning and design phase of this effort will identify the needs if they do exist, at least on a capacity level at those elementary schools. But no, this does not touch the quality of those schools in any way. None of these dollars would go to elementary schools unless it's identified that there's a capacity concern, in which case we would have to come back and present numbers for what that impact would be to the budget.
And the capacity concern, and Michael, you brought it up earlier, and it's one I certainly have voiced, is that, you know, as a parent who just had a child go to start at Walker and just seeing kind of the exodus, if that grade level stays on at the elementary and you have a child that can start in kindergarten and be at the same school with that same cohort through 5th grade, which is what the county does, you're not going to have that attrition until after 5th grade. And so the number of students that are in 5th grade today does not equal the number of students in 5th grade when they get to stay at their elementary school continuously through 5th grade. So that's the concern and an issue that I raised when we've had these conversations with the schools, because I do think that it could put capacity constraints on the elementary schools, which is why it's in scope for what this consultant is looking at, like assessing that and determining, is that going to be a risk that we're taking on?
Okay.
The conversation, there's still some issues in terms of like the segregation, as it's been said. And one of the main ones is the busing. West Haven students still go to Burley Moran when Venable is a school in their district. Access to the private schools and when is another big factor that comes up. And while this has been, discussed as how do we keep students who parents can take them out in the schools, the conversation has to, be viewed as how do we make sure that the students who stay in these schools have quality schools, to attend. And that has been something that has been delayed. We're having conversations about budget concerns now, and there's been a significant number of parents who, at this time during the pandemic in this community, who pulled their kids out because they can, and to make sure that what they viewed as a potential disruption to education, hasn't occurred. So that's one, I think, of the primary reasons in terms of wrapping our head and maybe deciding with staff today is, or if June, or hopefully not, or, at whatever date, if this is a priority, if you all haven't spent any significant time in Walker or Beaufort or Jacksonville or Johnson compared to like a Venable or Greenbrier, then it's helpful to just see how much we've ignored these buildings in what we call a world-class city, and that we expect, for, our kids to be able to thrive in them. And that's only one aspect, because you can change a building, and we all know based on other conversations that there's a lot of other stuff that we also need to change. But I don't know if you all have seen any of the videos with modernization, but the kids are thrilled about when these modernizations occur, and it just lifts them. And if you've seen those videos, just being able to do that at just a much larger scale, and that the environment that you're in does play a significant part in how you feel and are able to operate in that space. So it is important for us to figure out how to get this done, or at least dedicate I'm for getting this done, but at least dedicate the funding for some of the major renovation modernizations that the schools that have been delayed overall.
I also just wanted to clarify that the bullets in that first slide are extracted from a presentation that was done, put together and presented by school staff and the school board. And we wanted to certainly acknowledge the language and the components of the reconfiguration from their position. Those are not the goals of the project team. We didn't invent those. We want to bring those to the beginning of the conversation as what was brought to the city to work from. And there are words, so the concepts of the segregation history, but also the goals around addressing equity in this project are part of that original set of bullets.
I have a few questions. Some of it's kind of things to think about. How is it? So as I understand, the reconfiguration moving 5th grade back into elementary school is really now in education considered a best practice for children and for their education and their well-being.
That's correct.
Which is why I have been for the reconfiguration. But a few of the things I want us to think through, I guess, especially before we decide that this is 100% the way that we're going. And I think this is really also needs to be with the school board on this meeting, is aside, what are we going to be gaining from going through the reconfiguration process this way and not putting the money into just updating the schools in general? I think no matter what, we're going to need a significant amount of money. Even if we somehow didn't go with the reconfiguration plan, we're going to need significant amounts of money put aside to update these buildings. I've been in Walker, I've been in many of the elementary schools. We owe it to our children to give them a better place to be learning and staying 8 hours, 9 hours of their day in. I want to kind of have that better understanding, I guess, of how is this supposed to be decreasing the private school flight at 5th grade? How is this supposed to be, and what does that do for us as a city as a whole? Why are children leaving in middle school? And therefore, how does this help stop that? Or, and how is it aside from, I mean, is this preschool model over at Walker with the adult education, is that really the best use of that space in that way? I mean, I know there's lots of other committees that are working on that and thinking through that, and this is not my area of expertise. So I would like to, I guess, hear some more from about that.
Do we want to hear from them now? Because Chair McKeever is on the participant list and is willing to come speak to it. Obviously, this is like kind of off the cuff speaking to it. Our next meeting with them, I don't think is till the end of January for a more formal session with the full school board. But if I think information or hearing from a voice from the school board or the schools would be helpful, I know that that's possible right now.
Yeah, I think so. And Lisa are on here, so if either or both of them would like to add some clarity, I support it.
So I guess can Brian elevate them?
Jennifer, I'm getting an error message saying you've got an older version of Zoom, so I cannot enable you to speak right now. You would have to upgrade Zoom and come back to the meeting.
She can call in, right?
Probably quicker to just do a quick upgrade.
Would you check with Lisa to see if she wants to comment?
Yep.
Christine, I totally agree with your perspective. I think that's why we're looking at, no matter what, reconfiguration or not, our schools need a significant investment.
And I mean, from a budgetary standpoint, it's kind of a moot point whether it's investment in the school structures or whether it's investment in reconfiguration. It's still going to be tens of millions of dollars, no matter which way it goes. So from a budget perspective, I am definitely interested in some ideas about what like a 5% tax rate increase would look like and what that would get us. Especially if we could work with the schools to say during that time that this money is being put aside for school buildings in particular, that 100% of that tax increase goes into a fund for school buildings, whether it's reconfiguration or updates and facilities maintenance. I would definitely entertain the idea of the leftovers every year going into a designated fund for this.
Lisa is on.
Hi, everybody.
And Jennifer McKeever as well.
Okay.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for having us. Also, thank you for not putting the video camera on. That's amazing. Anyway, so thank you all for your questions. I think they're really important and honestly could cover a whole school board council meeting. And because, again, I don't know that me and Lisa just solo will be able to do justice to the questions that you guys have asked, but we're happy to try to answer them to the best of our ability. So if you guys want to, I don't want to assume which questions you guys want us to answer, but I'm happy to kind of ask you first what you were interested in hearing.
Sina, did you want to just lay out yours?
Sure. So, looking at this very high price tag of school reconfiguration, knowing that also doesn't include necessarily some of the upgrades to our elementary schools that might be necessary. Why reconfiguration? How does this help our children beyond giving a good facility upgrade? How does it help the private school kind of flight that's happening? Yeah.
Okay, so those are great questions, really important. And I want to start by saying that you can tell, and everybody who's on, who's been in these meetings with me have heard me say this a million times, that every time one of our students transitions from 4th to 5th, from 7th to 8th, and from 6th to 7th, and then from 8th to 9th, the academic, the need, there's a lot of catching up they have to do. So if you look at our numbers from year to year, from 4th grade to 5th grade, all of the the numbers just go down in literacy and in math, and all the SOL scores, the numbers go down. So that is one of that particular age group between 5th and 9th grade is already a very, well, at this point, I just want to say interesting time, emotionally and socially, it's just a huge growth time. So one of the reasons that reconfiguration became very attractive to the school board about 10 years ago was that having continuity in the school to watch over a student as the child grows and changes and develops during this time would be an improvement, and allow so that the fallback would not happen so dramatically, for example, between 5th and 6th grade and 8th and 9th grade. So if you look at our elementary schools, our kids are there from K4, and you can tell that the consistency of people in a student's life benefits them. And we believe that the students in 5th through 8th grade need that as well. And so this was one of the, so transitions being a very difficult thing for that age group, but also to have adults in the building who are watching over the students for longer periods of time, the 2-year period being, as you know, just long enough, but not long enough for grownups to be able to monitor and keep track of what's going on with students. So that was one, the main reason the reconfiguration came up was because of an efficiency study. I don't know how many of you all know that. I'm sure some of you do. And it was the recommendation was to close an elementary school. And so reconfiguration became attractive as a result, because to consolidate the middle school and then transform Walker or another school into a preschool center would allow for some savings operationally, but also, be able to close an. We did not find, as a school board, that closing an elementary school was something good for our neighborhoods and our community. So those are just some of the reasons that reconfiguration has kind of withstood the past decade as a main idea, because obviously we've had conversations over and over and over again whether reconfiguration was something we should continue to advocate for. But having 3 years in middle school was key. And of course, what you do with preschoolers became the question then. And that's why the preschool center came into being as an idea. So I just used a lot of words, and I'm happy to answer any questions, but I can continue on too. So I don't want to do that.
So, and I think to that end, Jennifer, if I may jump in. So what I think she described was why this was initially brought forward as a conversation back in 2008, 2009. So based on capacity then, and then our capacity has changed. Everything was kind of tabled, and here we are a few years ago looking at the opposite of we needed more room and we needed to do something, not just for the developmental and the pedagogical standpoints of why we felt it was better to decrease transitions, but we also now we're looking at overcapacity issues. So we wanted to look at how we could address that.
Could I ask, I guess, one sort of overarching strategic question? If we assume for the moment that the greatest crisis in our educational system is getting particularly poorer kids to read at grade level by, say, grade 3 or 4 or something like that, how does this get us there?
That's a big assumption, Mr. Snook.
Well, I know it is. And I don't know whether that's shared by anybody. It's certainly the perspective that people in the community would seem to have from what I'm hearing when I talk to people. And if it's not the assumption, then disabuse me.
Well, certainly getting children reading by 3rd grade is a huge priority of ours. And certainly if you look at our numbers, many, the numbers are not, they're never where I want them to be. I always want them to be better. And as is the whole division is constantly focused on growth. You can point to pretty much any variable that you would like in education and say that this is the crisis. So I would just like to not go into that sort of, well, what is it going to do to solve this problem? Honestly, algebra by 8th grade is also a huge issue. So, making sure, like, having continuity, I think we have great interventions in place, and we're continuing to work towards achieving the goal of having all of our students on grade level at 3rd grade. So having algebra by 8th grade is also very important. When you have a drop off like you see between 6th and 7th grade, it's very difficult to get to that metric. So that is also a priority for the division.
But I would also argue that the preschool attention could also be helping towards that elementary need with just the right, both programming and facilities for those with greatest need that aren't necessarily taking advantage of preschool programs or can't afford to. And honestly, obviously we have a lot of things that we're doing within the public system, but there's still a greater need than what is able to be met, is my understanding. And so I can see that being part of this broader picture. But what I'm still unclear, maybe Mike can help remind me, with our current scope, what is it right now? It's just evaluating what that programming would look like for preschool. It doesn't involve a full renovation of Walker. Is that correct?
Can you hear Mike?
Yeah, sorry, I had an audio drop out for a while there. Yeah, presently our plan is to actually take it through schematic design for Walker, which includes the preschool. And I think that makes sense because there's really no way to divide the two.
But the estimate, the cost estimates, does that
Yeah.
include both? Okay.
Yeah, that comes with both, yes.
Okay, just want to make sure.
And my understanding too, just for everybody's information, is my understanding is we're also going to get some understanding of the cost of the returning the fifth graders back to the elementary schools on part of the scope as well. Is that correct? Mike, you're just frozen there.
Yeah, it seems like Mike's having a little bit of technical issues, but Jennifer, I think yes.
Okay.
Those are all elements of the planning phase. And if you, I believe that this morning, Chrissy sent a copy of the RFP, the language that provides the background of what this planning and design effort is asking for. And so that initial paragraph talks about reassigning the early learning services to the then vacant Walker Upper Elementary campus, extensive consideration for wraparound services. And then further down, it talks about working through that planning process.
We are happy to stay on while you guys have your discussion. So if you have any further questions, feel free.
I have
of course.
Yes. And again, this is just so that I'm getting a clearer understanding in an area that is very far from my realm. So we were talking about if moving fifth graders back to elementary school, that is keeping them in the elementary school 1 year longer with that cohort and a smaller kind of, I guess, area where they're still being known by their principal, by gym teacher, music teacher. It would still be that same kind of elementary model then.
Yes.
So they're going to have a lot of teachers at that age that would have known them possibly since kindergarten.
Correct.
Then moving over to a 3-year junior high model, which they would start rotating all their teachers just a year later than they are now, which adds some stability, bringing that into a slightly older age. But also they have the same counselors then for 3 full years. They have people, that I guess a lot of the gym teachers would still be the same. The music teachers would still be the same. So there would again be a continuation of some core teachers that they might see for 3 straight years then, instead of and it's more about the changing of the people in their lives every 2 years than it is about the facility. But the facility being the way that it is able to efficiently happen.
I mean, it is definitely the main issue are the people, and the limiting factor, of course, is the facility. However, the facility, as you know, is very in need of renovation. So that's it's just combining those two issues, but yes, the facility definitely needs renovation, and having a 3-year middle school, we believe will support our students, support our students in a way uniquely in a way that they cannot be supported right now.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. So I guess the question for us at this time is if we are in a space where we can say that based on the information that we have to date, whether we are still trying to do both projects whether we're saying that we understand that the schools and the dollar amount, but we're committing to that, or we're committing to West Main Street, and understand that at the current tax rate and what's remaining in the budget, that we have the, 52 million, and anything that exceeds that is going to present. And it sounds like even trying to do both of these things would present some major, like some creative challenges for trying to figure out budget, and it will leave it sounds like no room for us to think about other things that might be introduced. I thought in my head right now is just if something comes up with the affordable housing priority that we continuously say that we're setting, and we have no room to assist there. And so where are you all in regards to being able to make a decision between those two choices, and then understanding that between now and June, or by June, and in the discussions with school board, that we will definitely have more discussion about the potential scope of this work and what we can do, and any other challenging conversations that we might have to have with them about operation modernization reconfiguration.
I think, well, I'll just give my perspective. I think that it's important that we do kind of allocate this sizable chunk, what 50 million seems to be the number that we're talking about, out in these future years, knowing that a lot more information is to come. And also just really do want to explore, I'm with Sina on that. I really would like us to make a commitment for a significant amount of any surplus to be going towards that purpose, to try to alleviate some of that strain in future years. Because in the same boat, I also just feel that we should be committed through phase 2 of West Main Street, given the investment that's been made, the dollars that are coming from outside sources. I really struggle to walk away from that project wholesale, recognizing that if we just do the maintenance of that corridor as was proposed, we're not accomplishing any of the goals of all the effort that's been put into, and a tremendous amount of community engagement, and I realize it's not going to be popular with some folks, but I just can't think of a corridor that's more important to have us have that pedestrian and bicycle safety. And I just think it's just such a really important component of our infrastructure in the city, that I really would be hesitant for us just to put the brakes on that fully, but recognizing those future phases are certainly up in the air and have gaps to fill. So that's kind of where I'm at. And I think that the 50 million is still not enough, but that's where I think we have to rely on, as we get more information and we see other options moving forward, or whether it's the surplus dollars, or how do we look at this formula. There's likely gonna have to be a tax increase of some level. And I don't like stretching us this far, but I just feel like for right now, we almost have to just at least have that as a placeholder commitment, much like we have other things just out there. And as we get more information, but that's kind of where I am right now. Additionally, if I look back at the bonds authorized versus issued, I'm not really clear on where we are with Tonsler Park and that infrastructure improvement. That's at 2.1 million. I know I'm gonna get in trouble for saying this, but like our bypass fire station, I know that there's through design, but is that something that we could put down the road further? And maybe someone can tell me that's not an option. But when I was going through that list, those are two things that just kind of came up to me of like, do these things have to be done right now when we have these other priorities and dollars tied up in other projects? I saw Emily pop up because she heard me say that.
And I think it's also interesting, like for us, we have to consider the unfunded project for staff, all the things that are coming up at this, moment that we've been spending, like even the surplus on, right? And we've been I wrote down, like, if someone were to ask me today, I have them, what would be my 5 goals for now, and stabilizing the community through the food insecurity issues and housing is my first goal. So if we allocate the surplus and some of those needs come up with no additional CARES dollars, is that something that we even can realistically do? I know before we had conversations about other infrastructure needs, we had the CPD come out to their employees and talk about the maintenance needs in their departments during the last budget cycle. And then I don't have an update about the fire station project, but I would need more information about like what are we keeping and what are we placing. If you said fire station or schools, I got it. I get it. If you were saying fire station or West Main Street, then I have a lot of additional questions.
Well, just speaking for myself, there are still a number of questions that were generated by today that I'd like to have some answers on and some further thought given to before I make a categorical statement of, yes, I want to favor this over that. I want to do both. I want to do neither. There's still questions that I need to think about some. And I guess the real question that I haven't heard, and maybe you all don't know the answer to this, and maybe that's what this further study is going to reveal, is what would be the timeline for any money from the city going to the school project. It sounds like you're not even going to have a proposal put together until June of 2021. I assume, therefore, that you wouldn't actually start any construction, at least until sometime, a year or so down the road from there. And is this something where we would be thinking we're going to be spending $50 million all at once? Are we going to be spending $25 million in 2 consecutive years? How is this going to be phased? That's the kind of information that I think we need to know if we're going to look at. I mean, we know we've got some phasing issues on some affordable housing commitments, for example. We can anticipate that there will be phasing issues on West Main Street streetscape, certainly for the schools. We need to see how those all kind of fit together to know whether we are truly in a situation where we're trading one against the other. I'm not convinced we are.
And I'm not trying to state my position as if I'm just saying this is where my thoughts are now. There's a lot more information to be had, but I'm getting the sense that staff would just like some directional, so that they can start to crunch more of these scenarios for us. And I think we're on the same page with that. I just wanted to clarify. I'm not putting my foot in the ground right now. I'm just trying to say this is where I'm coming from. If it's helpful to staff to hear our inner thoughts, that's all.
Well, and one very specific thing I'd like to know is this question of what is the suggestion about what kind of money would be needed by the schools to do what they want to do.
Yeah, I think your timeline, I can speak to that to a certain extent. I think your timeline that you laid out is about right. We would get to kind of a schematic design phase at the end of this coming calendar year, 21. And then we would go into sort of a bid documents phase after that. So yeah, I think somewhere mid the following year is when we would get to the point of being able to bid it out.
Which means what? Mid of calendar 2022?
That would be calendar 22, yes.
So either the fiscal year ending in 2022 or the fiscal year ending in 2023. To where we would have to start putting money in is my real question.
Right.
Okay.
And I can also add to your question of phasing. In the process of negotiating, there have been some phasing conversations. It is our intention to bring probably all of council, it sounds like would be a good idea, together as soon as we have a contract in place, which I think should be very early next year, next calendar year, to sort of run through some phasing ideas. And that would be a pretty good way of explaining different scenarios of how the expenditures could be done, the construction could be done. And I can't speak 100% to that yet, since we're really don't know what we're doing yet, but I think pretty quickly in the process, you would be able to see some things that would add some clarity there.
Thank you.
First off, I would just like to thank everybody so very much for just within a few weeks' time here, you've pulled together a lot of information and a lot of options and problem solved a lot of things. And I just want you to know I truly appreciate it. And these are just really hard decisions, and we want to say yes to everything and make it all happen. And just thank you. As far as like, I know we're going to have to, no matter what happens, we have to put a significant amount of money into our schools. I had also, have heard in the past, the school board and the superintendent talk about knowing that the city is not going to be able to shoulder all of that. So I am interested in hearing, that's also going to affect, I think, some budgetary issues here, is hearing from them how much they've been thinking about going out to other ways, or if there's any other inventive ideas about financing some of that. I'm also very concerned about, affordable housing. That's another one, as Mayor Walker said, is a huge piece of this too, that we are being recommended to spend $10 million a year for 10 years on affordable housing. And is that supposed to all come from the city coffers, or is that as a community in general? Can we look at trying to do some of that in some other ways? I'm throwing out, TIFs just as an example of other things out there that we might be able to utilize for some ideas. We have lots of very big price tag things and only a certain amount of revenue, and I know that, and it's hard to prioritize these different things. So
I guess, or you can go ahead.
No, sir, after you.
I guess my thoughts are, I guess my biggest consideration thinking about West Main Street is just the amount of money left on the table from the existing matching funds plus $5 million from UVA, and just leaving all that money that's as well as anything that could potentially come for phase 3 in that application. Definitely a lot of, just seems like a missed opportunity for that much money to be on the table. There's left there. And question mark I have as well is, if we're thinking about readjusting the West Main project, if we're only doing phase 1 and phase 2, are we just sort of cutting the baby in half in terms of having a project that's not achieving the utility of the original design and intention? And if that's the case, we just may have to make a decision there whether we can't sort of get to a halfway point that's achieving what the original vision was. That's an open question to me. I don't know if that's the case or not, but push comes to shove. Schools, I would definitely put schools as a higher priority than the West Main streetscape project. Clear, at least for me, clearly a higher priority, despite the fact that I've got a lot of reservations about leaving all that money on the table. It does seem to me that, like, even if we assumed that we weren't doing any of the phases of West Main Street, that the cost of school reconfiguration would still require us to make meaningful cuts in our CIP budget, as well as probably adjustments in our general fund, and certainly adjustments in terms of our policies, in terms of what's going to schools for operational expenditures or surplus policies, et cetera, in addition to tax increases. So I just think that's important for us to figure out, that even if we're saying no to West Main Street and yes to schools, there's still going to be a lot more that we're going to have to figure out what we're going to cut and reprioritize. At least that seems like to me what the case would be. And I don't know exactly what what all those cuts in the CIP would be, at least at this moment. And I would throw out again, I think one of them, which still wouldn't get us all the way there, but is the parking garage at $10 million. When we're thinking about these priorities, it's just a tremendous waste of money and is not in alignment with any of our stated priorities in terms of our top goals and top needs, in that we are, at least for a portion of that $10 million, the expenditure is a conscious policy decision to build more than the required parking spaces required under the deal. And that is, just throw it out again as another area when we're thinking about these really difficult priorities that we're trying to decide amongst.
One thing I would like to ask Council, Chief Palicha did want to offer, if you all have any questions about the fire station, she just wanted to let you know, if you have any questions, she's happy to answer them right now.
And I'm happy to give just a really quick why it's on there and what the scope is. I see thumbs up and heads nodding. Crystal could probably speak better to the full scope in terms of the facility management development side. But this project, so originally in 2016, there was a facilities needs assessment and station location study done, a pretty comprehensive one that the city paid for. And at that time, it was recommended this station be replaced. It's 1961 was when it was built. So it's almost 60 years old. Everything about it is outdated. The three big categories really are safety, maintenance, and equity. There's, in terms of safety, the bay isn't sealed, so the exhaust is throughout the building, which is in all of our other facilities, we've got cancer risk reduction measures in place, and that one's, makes it very challenging to do that. There's no fire alarm system or sprinkler system. There's nowhere to do decontamination, and there's no fitness facility. So from a employee safety perspective, that's a big challenge. In terms of equity, there's no privacy. The bunk rooms are not actual rooms. They just have these dividers, kind of these divider partitioner walls between them, which particularly in a time like this where, trying to keep air quality as, isolated to a single person as possible, it's very challenging. And also in terms of two genders having, it's a very antiquated station. There's no female facilities in any of the rooms or specific restrooms. There's just one big restroom, and not big, small, but and then the last thing is maintenance. Pretty much all of the systems are either failing or projected to fail. Roof, water, lines, just the infrastructure within the building. So the maintenance is becoming increasingly more expensive. That station, it's a great location. That one engine covers about 20 to 23% of our calls. So it actually runs a fair bit between the 29 North Corridor and Greenbrier, and then the bypass over to the Pantops area in North Downtown. So it's definitely outdated. And I would just offer as a final comment about a fire station versus other types of facilities. We're the only department that, we're the only employees that we ask to live on premise. And, these folks live in the building. Our firefighters live here 24/7. And so, it's a quality of life issue. And that's really the bottom line. Our vehicles barely fit in the building anymore. There's literally about 3 inches on either end of the units. And we've had to buy units based on making them fit in there. So I will let Crystal add anything if she wants. She can speak more specifically to how far along the project is and where we are with that. But thank you.
Sure, and I don't want to take too much time, but we also have Scott Hendricks. He's the project manager for this particular project on the call. And so if there are specifics, in fact, this is a project that's been previously brought to council, and some additional funding has been essentially consolidated to support this effort. So the total approved funding for the project is about $5.9 million. And currently our authorization on this work is to proceed through preliminary design, which is basically where we are now. And so at this point, there are some key decision points as well about moving this process forward. I'd like to just give Scott a chance. If anyone has any sort of more technical questions about the project, he would be best to answer them.
I guess my only questions, thank you to both Emily and Crystal. I think the only questions I'm having now is understanding like what that timeline looks like, because you're saying that the total exceeds right now what we're showing on our issued but not authorized. So we have to bridge that gap. And I'm just trying to understand like how this affects the timeline. So right now we are fully funded for this project. Ryan's nodding his head. Okay.
Yes, there was the 3.7 is still on the authorized but not issued, but there was some previous funding from another project that had been moved from another fire related project into this project. So there is no additional gap that we know of unless there's been changes to design.
And then just what is the current timeline for when, you know, they're at design, like when it would be implemented and we would see the facility in place? When would this money be tapped is my question, I guess.
Scott, can you jump in here?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Can you, a little bit louder,
but yes.
Great. Okay. So Scott Hendricks here. I'm the project manager, and work has been going on for about a year. It was halted for a while, partly due to COVID and partly due to some cost overruns we were experiencing. We've redesigned, actually what we did initially, we designed a 15% and then got a cost estimate and made some adjustments to that to stay within budget. We're at the point now where we're ready to push forward into design development, which would get us from about a 35% design up to about 65% design. Waiting for authorization from executive staff to move forward on that. I will say about the funding that about half of the funding was a CIP. The other half of the funding was deferred maintenance and other things that the fire department basically gave up. So there were other renovations to other fire station facilities that were going to occur. That money was all combined and rolled in to make the nearly the $6 million number that we have come up to. So they've sacrificed a good bit already. I'd love to see this project move forward if it's possible. Emily did a great job of analyzing what the improvements could be. Safety and health is a key factor for this project. It is somewhat of an environmental nightmare at the existing station where it is now, and a health concern for city employees in the fire department. And I'm happy to answer any other questions about the budget or timeline or.
Yeah, Scott, maybe you could say, if we were to get the green light to move forward now, when would we envision construction?
We'd be ready to bid. What a cute child. We'd be ready to bid about a little less than a year from now. And we'd probably be under construction sometime in early 22.
The only other thing I'd add is that I will happily meet any of you all if you'd like at the station and give you a tour of it. It'll take about 4 minutes.
I was gonna say, I've actually been in that station. We dropped off Girl Scout dinner one night. I could not see knocking this off our CIP.
I appreciate all the information in the background. Just trying to go through this list and see where we have anything to get, that's all.
And we have committed the architectural fee and spent about 20% of that already. So there's some investment already in this project.
No, all very helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So when are we getting a proposal on this, or are you all asking us at this moment to make a decision? Sounded like there was an immediate question. This is coming to us later.
It's already been approved as part of the CIP. So only if you wanted to take it off would we need it.
Okay, so when Crystal just said the red light, I just, with green light, that's what you said, not red. That's what I was referring to. Was there something else that needed to happen?
No, I think that's at our executive staff level.
So I guess, Chrissy, where are you feeling with what you're hearing? And I mean, it's 3:40 and we know you guys want answers from us, and we've given some direction, but we also know that more information is, is always wanted before making tough decisions. But
we need to have public comment too.
And I'm going to defer to John.
And I'll just say before they chime in, I think we're in the same space we're in before we got here.
But with a lot more information and understanding of options, which have been really helpful. I want to echo that appreciation that Councilor McGill shared earlier. I just feel like the way this has been presented and the detail is just really helpful to really get our head around like what's ahead of us. But there still obviously is more information to come, but I'm hoping that we could at least directionally let them know where we're leaning and what we're not going to consider. And it sounds like schools is still everyone's is a priority, which is what we articulated a couple weeks ago.
Yes, but if they brought it back to us today, I think that they are still confused about whether we're asking them to do both or whether we're saying that until we figure out schools, we're not moving forward with the West Main, or whether we're moving forward with West Main and we'll fit in schools with what's remaining. I'm hearing the same thing I heard during the budget work session that we just had.
Well, let me offer a few things. First is a practical consideration, which is we have to present the CIP to the Planning Commission before it comes to you all. Saying that we've rescheduled it to January, but it sounds like, and I guess the first thing I'd like to ask is, it sounds like this really, the CIP is not going to ultimately, you all aren't going to give a true final direction for us until you have your joint meeting with the school board and get more details from them. Is that a fair statement?
I just feel like that regardless of those conversations, that like we were saying before, if it's reconfiguration or something else, this is a considerable investment. This is tens of millions of dollars. And so I don't think 50 is offlandish, whether we do reconfiguration or whether it's truly just improving our existing facilities without that component. I think it's going to require that.
All right. Well, if 50 is really what, let's just ask this, well, not ask, but if the council is committed to 50, I think what we can do is start to, and again, 50 not meaning reconfiguration, but 50 could be upgrades to each facility, or it could be reconfiguration. But again, we're talking about debt capacity right now, 58 million, right? So 50 of that 58, it sounds like is schools that we should program in 50 for schools. That sounds like what I'm hearing today.
Well, I think until we get the feedback, which is, we have went in the CIP school sessions that the work group or whatever, task force, whatever we are, that we've done is, until we get, the information back, we won't really know what that amount is. I don't know how it sounds like you could potentially cripple a project by putting it at a lower amount. Then you may have to have a different discussion in June.
And I'm not intending to close the door that it might not be more. I'm just saying that given the current constraints we have, that at a minimum, as it says, we're looking to do that. I'm sorry, I cannot get these children to not bother me right now. Sorry, people.
I think that what we have to do is say that we would be committed to the schools, maybe is that our primary focus or not? And whether we know that early, like June, July, we will be having conversations, and that we know that we will include the school board and the staff in those conversations about how we can move forward based on the information that we then have. I think trying to have a discussion about a dollar amount before we get that information from the experts, which is what we have been unable to make a lot of the decision point, discussions, even in the working group, because we don't have that information yet. So if we say 50 million and it comes back at 65, we've cut ourselves out of 15 million. Or maybe it comes in at 100 million and we say we're only going to do 50, and that means that we have to change the scope or look at in more detail the recommendations they made for the elementary schools, or maybe the preschool can't go to, when my daughter went to preschool at the Jefferson School, right? Like my son went to preschool at Clark. So these things have been changing all the time. And maybe, that's part of the discussion we'll have once we have the information. But I think if the commitment is there, I think staff is waiting for us to make a commitment on at least these two big things today.
I guess I would say I would like to continue on the assumption that we're going to fund the streetscape project, and obviously, hopefully, we can realize those savings that have been suggested through value engineering. I'd also like to figure that we're going to do the again, $50 million seems like a reasonable figure as a placeholder for now. And if it turns out that $100 million is necessary, then we would have to go back and say, there's no point in our putting in $50 million into a project that's only going to get half done. Let's rethink this thing from the get-go. And if it's going to be $55 million, maybe we can make that work. But there's not that much wiggle room there. I also, and recognizing that none of these things, as I continue to complain, nothing in Charlottesville is ever settled until it's actually built. There's still going to be opportunity to rethink it all. But I think both projects are important. My concern, frankly, is, again, partly because I'm a newbie. There have been a lot of discussions and a lot of rationales offered in prior years that I haven't seen and I haven't read, and I would love to see and read them. In the meantime, I'm asking questions that may seem like dumb questions because I haven't seen what other folks have seen. So, but I am prepared to assume, based on what I know, that I would A, support $50 million for the schools, and B, I would support continuing with the streetscape project. And then we'll just have to figure out, admittedly, that doesn't leave much room for anything else, but we'll have to figure that out as we go. That's not much of an answer, but it's what I've got for now.
Anyone else have any comments before we open it up for public comments?
Well, like I said, I mean, I think, schools come up as a higher priority for me than West Main Street. And I would certainly like both to be funded, but I think when we're looking at the numbers, that doesn't really seem feasible. I mean, again, it seems like $50 million for schools on its own is going to require, even if we zero out West Main Street, is going to require looking to cut additional areas in the CIP budget, our general fund, and tax increases. And I maybe we have a wonderful economic rebound very quickly and we're in much better financial straits and the Republican Senate passes major stimulus. But until that occurs, it seems like that's just the situation that we're in. And I would put schools as a higher priority than West Main Street there. And again, just think we're going to also need to look to other areas beyond just that.
Counselor McGill, or do you have any additional comments?
No, I don't have any additional comments.
Okay. Mr. Blair, do you have any additional comments before we open it up for public comments?
Well, 2 quick points. One would be if you have any more specific questions in terms of council about either of these projects, if you can email them to us and we will get you more answers. But please email your questions to us. And again, the budget office and public works team will work to get you the best information that they've got. Second, after the public comment, Mayor Walker, I know Ms. Hamill did want to discuss the extending the strategic plan for 1 more year for the budget in terms of their compliance.
Okay.
I just really quick want to say, to staff and to Mr. Blair, like nothing, like you've presented us with everything that we have available to us right now. So you've gone through a tremendous effort and that is so appreciated. I think that the things that are just uncertain right now are just a matter of time and trying to understand having more information that we just know that no one has right now. And so I don't want this to be a reflection. We certainly see that you're putting everything possible in front of us that we can. Staff on the public works side certainly has provided a lot of information. And so that's greatly appreciated. At this point, it's just timing of us getting more information from people that are beyond those that are joining right now. So I just wanted to clarify that. And again, thank you to staff for all the tremendous efforts on both of these initiatives and the overall budget.
It's just about having that last little bits of information for me that's going to put me over on this seesaw that's barely balancing of what is the least wrong decision here. I mean, or the best decision, or, just how to be as responsible with public funds to provide for the public well-being as far as I can. So thank you very much for everything.
Okay, I think so before the public comment, I think we can jump into this discussion. Chrissy, Ms. Hamill, do you have any new information you want to present, or about the strategic plan, or do you want us to just talk about just where we are and then we can get some staff feedback on that?
Yeah, I would just defer to you in terms of the budget presentation and our budget book. There is an expectation that we tie to some strategic plan priorities. And so, the path of least resistance would be to extend the current plan 1 more year to give you all time to work on that. But that would I would defer to you all for that discussion.
And I think that's the agreement and council, if it has changed at this point, is to extend it and to work on getting a panel, a group together to have some initial discussion around what this process should look like. That includes administration, department directors. I mean, we'll work with Mr. Blair on who that committee looks like and adding some citizens to it. And then there will be 2 council members that will sit on this too. And we are looking at maybe having these meetings if Mr. Blair agrees that that's a good timeline in February, since we don't have any budget meetings, but not kicking off the official process again until April, which will hopefully get us the document, have time to work on a plan to have the document to influence the, what is that, 23 budget? Yeah. So does that work for what you
That would be great.
did today? Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So we'll work on that with figuring out what this committee looks like, and of course, making sure we have those very public conversations. And by April, it should include all staff members, the entire council, and, you know, working to build this together after I'm thinking maybe 3rd or 4th week of April, probably 4th, to get it started with the very public facing format that we started with this last month, or whatever month it was, you all know. So that sounds, and we can talk more about that and just, you know, and get everything kind of organized and aligned there.
And I'll just add, like, and you just alluded to it, like we're open to hearing your feedback on this process, because some of you actually have been through this before, and we've obviously had conversations around it before, but we want this to be as collaborative as possible, including your feedback on this timeline. If there are things that, you know, we've just laid out that aren't going to work for staff for whatever reason, we just want to know. Thank you.
Okay. Is that okay for that session? That part, number 4 or 5, whatever. All right, and in terms of the priority discussion, it's based on the time, we should just probably add this to the end of the council, the December 7th council meeting, to have that discussion. Okay. All right, and so now, Mr. Willer, we can open it up for public comment.
Thank you, Mayor Walker. We have 18 people in the audience right now. If you'd like to speak to council about the capital budget or the strategic plan, you can have up to 3 minutes. Just click the raise hand icon in the Zoom webinar. If you're watching via channel 10 or Facebook and you want to join the meeting, you can go to charlottesville.gov/Zoom, register for the webinar, and join the conversation. Right now we have 3 people with their hands raised. First, we'll go to Elizabeth Stark, then Lisa Torres, then Richard Morris. Elizabeth, you're on with City Council. You've got 3 minutes.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Stark. I'm a resident of Charlottesville. I live on Fairway Avenue. I want to say I appreciate the work that the councilors and city staff have done today to present all these budget options in such a challenging time. As a community member, I ask that you prioritize schools, affordable housing, and community support over things like streetscapes, and definitely over parking garages. Understanding that there are significant budget shortfalls, I'd also like to ask that we look more closely at the police budget. I'd like council to insist that the police department be entirely transparent about their budgeting needs and release a line item budget to council and the public. We deserve that information. Once we have that, I ask that we look at ways to move funding away from the police department by implementing a hiring freeze, a capital spending freeze, not filling vacant positions, of which I understand there are several, and cutting back significantly on discretionary spending, like the meals budget, where there was $1,000 allocated, but $40,000 spent. And I know that some of these amounts may seem minor, but $40,000 is nearly half the salary needed to fill a staff position that would allow tenants the right to counsel. I also ask that council strongly consider that before we fund a ballooning police budget, we have to care for our community by supporting the Charlottesville Affordable Housing Plan with full funding. We need affordable housing. We need to slow skyrocketing real estate prices, and we need to protect tenants' rights. Buford and Walker are crumbling. I have a student who's been through Walker and attends Buford now. and have another student who will be attending Walker next year. They must be renovated. The city's kids deserve full support. As a community member, I'd also like to see the council continue to find a way to get better data on policing in Charlottesville. If we know how many calls are answered and if we know how many calls answered are actually related to policing, we'd be much better able to decide how to allocate funds to other more supportive institutions like the Mental Health Crisis Unit and initiatives proposed by the Mental Health Task Force and More Just Charlottesville. I hope you'll take this into consideration. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Mayor Walker, next up is Lisa Torres. Lisa, you're on with council.
Thank you, Mayor Walker, Council, Mr. Blair, and staff. I just wanted to extend our gratitude for letting us jump in and offer information. We appreciate the ongoing support for schools. I understand that there's a lot of questions, and I just wanted to offer that we are always available if you have questions and want to funnel those through Mr. Blair and to Dr. Atkins and the rest of us. We're happy to address those individually. We are also happy to take anybody on facility or school tours if you would like to see any of the buildings, and are happy through Chair McKeever, we're also happy to offer, a work session if we need something before January to hash through some of this. So thank you again for everything.
Thank you.
Again, if you'd like to raise your hand to get in line, just click the raise hand icon in the Zoom webinar. Next up is Richard Morris. Richard, you're on with council and you've got 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Walker and council. My name is Richard Morris. I am the program director of the Urban Agriculture Collective, a program of Cultivate Charlottesville. UAC maintains an urban garden in Charlottesville. We work in partnership with residents. Our gardens produce thousands of pounds of fresh produce every year, and that produce feeds hundreds of families from public and subsidized housing communities. This food is distributed at no cost to Charlottesville communities that might not otherwise have access to fresh produce. The challenge we face right now is that urban gardens cannot flourish in a place where their future is uncertain. Last year, for example, UAC lost 90% of our urban farmland to redevelopment and will lose the rest in 2022. Likewise, our farmer friends at IRC New Roots are in a similarly precarious situation. At minimum, the city is losing an acre of urban farmland that has been feeding Charlottesville families for over 12 years. We believe that urban growing spaces are a necessary component of a healthy city. COVID has taught us that local food production and fostering a culture of growing food in the city is a critical step in flattening the hunger curve for the next crisis. We ask that as part of the city's long-term planning, Charlottesville deepens its commitment to long-term investment in urban agriculture for our residents. Besides food, urban gardens can provide produce, greens space, job training for youth, and, as we've learned, a hedge against the next pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor Walker, there are no other hands raised.
Okay. Are there any other comments? Staff or counselors? All right. Well, thank you all for the work that you presented to us again today. And hopefully at some point during this budget process, we'll be able to allow you all to leave without doing that at the end of it. So we appreciate your work.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Yeah.
Don't think about us.
Have fun next week, hopefully. Be safe.
Gobble, gobble.